I never imagined my morning would start with me standing knee-deep in snow, gripping a cup of cold coffee in one hand and a frozen shovel in the other, staring in disbelief at the massive white SUV squatting in my freshly cleared driveway. It was half buried under the thick layer of snow that had fallen overnight, parked like it had claimed permanent residence. At first, I thought maybe it belonged to some poor soul who got stranded in the storm and had no choice but to leave their car behind. But as I stepped closer, brushing off some of the snow from the back window, my stomach dropped. Right there, in obnoxiously bold letters, was the unmistakable laugh, love sticker. Karen. Of course, it was Karen. The woman had a talent for twisting reality to suit her needs, always managing to get away with whatever nonsense she pulled. If there was a conflict in the neighborhood, she was in the middle of it, yet somehow, she always played the victim. And now, her car was blocking my driveway like she had just claimed it under some unspoken suburban conquest law. I stormed over to her house, still clutching my coffee and shovel, and pounded on her door. No answer. I knocked again, harder this time, rattling the door frame. Still nothing. Just as I was about to start shouting, I heard slow, lazy footsteps from inside. The door cracked open just enough for Karen to poke her head out, her blonde curls still pinned up in rollers, a silk robe loosely tied over pajamas. She squinted at me like I had woken her from some deep, spiritual meditation. "Oh," she said, suppressing a yawn. "What's the problem?" I blinked. The problem? Was she serious? "Your car," I said, my voice already rising. "It's in my driveway." "Oh yeah," she muttered, like I had just reminded her to take out the trash. "My driveway's all icy, and yours looked better. Figured it'd be fine." I stared at her, waiting for the punchline, but she just stood there like this was the most natural thing in the world. She shrugged. Shrugged. Like she had borrowed a cup of sugar instead of illegally stealing my entire driveway. "You figured," I echoed, barely containing my frustration. "Karen, you're blocking my entire driveway. How am I supposed to leave for work?" She rolled her eyes. "Relax," she said, waving a hand dismissively. "I'll move it later." The snowplow didn't even come by yet. Before I could get another word in, she shut the door in my face. I stood there, coffee cooling in my grip, rage simmering beneath my frozen exterior. I briefly considered calling a tow truck right then and there, but I decided to give her one last chance. Surely, after another round of snowfall, she'd realize how ridiculous she was being and move it. Spoiler alert, she didn't. By the time I woke up the next morning, I already had a bad feeling. The kind of feeling that settles deep in your gut before you even know why. I pulled back the curtain, hoping, praying, that Karen had finally come to her senses and moved her car. Instead, my heart sank. Not only was her SUV still parked exactly where I'd left it last night, but now, it was completely buried under a fresh blanket of snow. And the best part? The snowplow had come through, but seeing Karen's car blocking the driveway, the driver had decided to skip my house entirely. The rest of the neighborhood had clean, smooth roads while I stood there, staring at a towering wall of ice and snow piled up like a fortress in front of my property. I threw on my coat and stomped outside, my breath coming out in angry bursts as I grabbed my shovel and got to work. If Karen wasn't going to move her car, then fine, she could dig herself out. I meticulously cleared every inch of my driveway, except for the area around her SUV. Let her deal with the frozen tomb she'd built for herself. After an hour of shoveling, sweaty and exhausted, I pulled out my phone and sent her a text. "Move your car or I'm calling a tow truck." Her response came an hour later. "Busy RN." Later. No apology. No acknowledgement that she'd turned my property into her personal parking lot. Just later. That afternoon, the situation went from bad to worse. I was inside, enjoying the first real moment of warmth all morning, when the smell of smoke drifted through my window. At first, I thought maybe someone was using their fireplace, but then I heard the laughing, the music, and the unmistakable sound of people gathering outside. I walked to the window and felt my eye twitch. Karen was throwing a goddamn winter barbecue. Who even does that? The smell of burning firewood thickened the air as her friends trickled into the neighborhood. And of course, where did they park? My driveway. By the time I made it outside, 3 cars were jammed in there, their tires digging deep, ugly tracks into the fresh snow I'd just spent an hour clearing. I stormed across the yard, boots crunching in the frost, and pounded on Karen's door for the second time in 2 days. It swung open, and there she was, drink in hand, breath laced with cheap wine, a smug grin stretched across her face. "Oh, hey," she said, like I was a guest she had been expecting. The neighbors showed up. "Hope you don't mind." I clenched my jaw. "Karen, move their cars. Now." She waved a dismissive hand. "Relax," she said, dragging out the word like I was overreacting. "It's just a little snow. It'll melt." My fingers tightened around my phone. "I'm not going to ask you again." She smirked, taking another sip of her drink. "Oh, what? You gonna call the tow truck again? Go ahead, see how that works out for you this time." And with that, she turned and shut the door in my face. Again. That was it. I was done playing nice. While Karen and her friends laughed and drank inside, I pulled out my phone and called the towing company. This time, I wasn't just getting her SUV towed. I scheduled multiple trucks to come at the crack of dawn and haul every single one of those cars out of my driveway. By the time Karen's little party wound down, my driveway was trashed. Beer cans, discarded napkins, and muddy footprints trailed all the way to my front porch. I didn't bother cleaning it up. Instead, I carefully gathered every single piece of garbage, stuffed it into a bag, and planned to return it to its rightful owner. Morning came with a crisp chill in the air. I brewed my coffee, stepped outside, and waited. Right on schedule, the tow trucks rolled into the neighborhood. One by one, Karen's guests' cars were lifted, hauled, and driven away. Then, like clockwork, Karen finally stumbled outside, robe wrapped tightly around her, slippers scraping against the pavement. She blinked at her now empty driveway, then spun in circles, as if expecting the cars to magically reappear. "Where's my car?" she shrieked, voice cracking with disbelief. I leaned against my porch railing, mug in hand, and took a slow, satisfied sip. "Looks like the snowplow got to it first," I said, barely hiding my grin. Her head snapped toward me, face burning red, her fury almost visible in the frozen air. "You can't do this," she screeched. "You're going to pay for this." I took another sip. "Actually," I said, tilting my head, "I think you're the one footing the bill this time." She stormed back inside, slamming the door so hard that a chunk of ice slid off her roof and crashed onto the pavement. I chuckled, savoring the moment, a rare sense of victory settling over me. But as I would soon find out, Karen wasn't done yet. Not by a long shot. By the next morning, I had almost convinced myself that Karen had finally learned her lesson. Her SUV was gone, her party guests had been forced to reclaim their towed cars, and the silence that blanketed the neighborhood was almost peaceful. Almost. But peace never lasted long where Karen was involved. Just before noon, I noticed her pacing up and down her driveway, phone pressed tightly to her ear, her free hand flailing dramatically. Even from across the street, I could hear the sharp edge in her voice. She wasn't just complaining, she was on a mission. An hour later, I found out exactly what that mission was when I opened my front door to see 2 police officers standing on my porch. "Mr. Adams?" one of them asked, their expressions neutral but weary. "We need to talk." I sighed, already knowing where this was going. Karen had filed a police report claiming that her SUV had been stolen. And, of course, I was the prime suspect. I ran a hand down my face, trying to keep my frustration in check as I explained, calmly, professionally, and with receipts, that I had done nothing illegal. Her car hadn't been stolen. I had it towed after she left it in my driveway for days. Fortunately, the officers saw through Karen's nonsense pretty quickly, especially when I showed them the tow company's invoice and my security footage of her ignoring my warnings. They gave me a knowing nod before heading back to Karen's house, and a few minutes later, she stormed back inside, slamming the door hard enough to rattle the windows. I should have been relieved. But if I knew anything about Karen, it was that when she lost, she didn't give up, she doubled down. And she did exactly that the very next day. I was halfway through clearing the last layer of ice from my driveway when I saw a thick, cream-colored envelope stuffed into my mailbox. At first, I thought it was a bill. Then I saw the HOA logo stamped in the corner. I tore it open and skimmed the contents. My hands tightened around the paper. The HOA was fining me for escalating neighborhood disputes and failing to resolve conflicts through proper channels. I let out a bitter laugh. Karen had ignored me for days, blocked my driveway, and hosted a full-on tailgate party on my property, and yet, I was the one being penalized. I marched over to the HOA office that afternoon, ready to fight the ridiculous charge, but the receptionist barely looked up when I presented the letter. A new rule was just passed, she said, flipping through a file. All personal property disputes must be settled privately before any outside services, like towing, are involved. It applies retroactively. Retroactively. I clenched my jaw so hard it hurt. Karen had successfully weaponized the HOA against me, twisting the situation until she was suddenly the victim and I was the unreasonable neighbor who had overreacted. But she wasn't done yet. That evening, just as I was settling into my couch, my doorbell rang. I was tempted to ignore it, but something about the frantic, rapid knocking made me sigh and pull myself to my feet. I swung open the door and there stood Karen, red-faced, shaking with fury. "You had no right," she spat, jabbing a finger toward my chest. I blinked. "Karen, what are you? You had my SUV towed with my mother's oxygen tank inside. She's been without it for days. She could have died." For a split second, my stomach twisted with guilt. If that were true, if I had unknowingly removed something essential to her mother's health. But then I took a step back, leveling her with a stare. "Why didn't you say anything when I told you to move your car?" I asked. "You could have let me know." Karen's lips pressed into a thin line. "I didn't think I had to," she shot back. "You were too busy playing dictator of the neighborhood." Something in her voice felt off. Too theatrical, too calculated. "If it was that serious, why didn't you go to the impound lot immediately?" I asked. "Why are you only bringing this up now?" Karen's expression flickered with something I almost missed, panic. Just for a second. Then, just as quickly, she smoothed it over with an exaggerated scowl. I exhaled sharply, already done with the conversation. "You know what? I'll call the lot tomorrow. If there's a missing oxygen tank, I'll pay to get it back." Karen's face twisted, like that wasn't the response she expected. Her shoulders squared. "You should," she snapped. "Because this is your fault." She stormed off before I could respond. The next morning, I made a few calls to track down her SUV. It didn't take long to get an answer, and when I did, I wasn't even surprised anymore. Not only had Karen already retrieved her car 2 days ago, but the impound worker laughed outright when I asked about a medical emergency. There was nothing in that car but a few fast food bags, he told me. No oxygen tank. No supplies. No nothing. I gripped my phone, pulse hammering with frustration. Karen had lied. Again. And this time, she had tried to use her own mother, her own flesh and blood, to make me look like the bad guy. I marched to her house and knocked, hard. The door creaked open, and there she was, looking smug. "I called the impound lot," I said flatly. "They said you picked up your car 2 days ago." A flicker of alarm flashed across her face before she smirked. Maybe they just forgot to mention it. I stared at her. "You really tried to guilt me with a fake medical emergency?" She scoffed. "Oh, come on. Don't act so innocent. You think you're some neighborhood hero because you called the HOA?" I exhaled through my nose. She wasn't going to admit anything. But I wasn't done yet, either. Because if she wanted to play dirty, I was about to play smarter. By the time I got back to my house, my hands were still clenched into fists. I had dealt with Karen's entitlement, her blatant disrespect, her ridiculous manipulation of the HOA, but this? Lying about a medical emergency just to guilt-trip me? That was a whole new level of low. But what Karen didn't realize was that she had finally crossed the wrong line. That night, I stayed up combing through every piece of footage my security cameras had captured. I had clear proof of her SUV blocking my driveway, video of her ignoring my warnings, footage of her tearing through my lawn like she was marking her territory. Even better, I had a crystal-clear shot of her bribing the snowplow driver, Todd, her secret little favor-for-favor boyfriend, to skip my house. By morning, I had everything I needed. I started with a call to the HOA board's higher-ups. Instead of arguing with the petty front office like last time, I went straight to the top with a carefully worded email, multiple attached videos, and a subject line they couldn't ignore. It didn't take long for things to spiral out of Karen's control. By that afternoon, she came stomping out of her house, phone glued to her ear, her voice shrill enough to pierce through the cold winter air. I leaned against my porch, arms crossed, enjoying the sight of her unraveling in real time. She had just learned what I already knew. The HOA had turned on her. Not only was she hit with several fines for violating parking regulations, damaging my property, and interfering with neighborhood services, but she had also lost her ability to host any more social gatherings indefinitely. No more rowdy parties. No more drunken barbecues with guests tearing through my yard. And best of all, Todd, her corrupt snowplow boyfriend, had been fired. With no one left to do her dirty work, her driveway was about to become a frozen wasteland. I half expected Karen to come banging on my door, screaming about how unfair it all was, but instead, she retreated inside like a sulking child. Maybe, for once, she had learned her lesson. Except, of course, she hadn't. That night, as I was getting ready for bed, my power suddenly cut out. I frowned. There hadn't been any reports of outages, no storm severe enough to knock out the grid. I grabbed my phone, checking the neighborhood alert system, but nothing. Then I glanced outside. And there she was. Karen stood at her window, barely visible behind the curtains, but I saw her smirking. And then, in her hand, I saw the telltale glow of a flashlight. My blood ran cold. The next morning, I walked out to check my breaker box, only to find a suspicious-looking tamper mark near the switch. I wasn't a professional electrician, but I knew enough to recognize when someone had deliberately messed with a power line. I called the HOA office. They were suddenly unhelpful. "We have no evidence of interference," they told me. "It sounds like an individual home maintenance issue." I almost laughed. Of course. Karen still had friends in the HOA. But I wasn't letting this go. I dug deeper, combing through my security footage. Sure enough, at 2:37 a.m., I caught a shadowy figure creeping around my side yard, near the electrical box. The image was blurry, but the size and stance were unmistakable. It was Karen's HOA buddy. This time, I didn't bother calling the HOA. I called the city's electrical department. An inspection was scheduled within hours, and when the technician arrived, he confirmed what I already knew: someone had intentionally tampered with my power. By the end of the day, the city had launched an official report, and the HOA was slapped with a violation for failing to regulate neighborhood utilities. Karen had no idea I had set the whole thing in motion. By evening, I sat on my porch, watching as she stormed out of her house, still on the phone, shouting at someone. Todd wasn't there to protect her this time. Her usual tricks weren't working. She had played dirty for weeks, but this time, I had played smarter. A few days after the power stunt, things in the neighborhood finally started to settle down. The HOA had no choice but to issue a formal notice about the tampering violation, and though they didn't directly name Karen, everyone knew exactly who was responsible. The best part? The city's involvement meant this wasn't something the HOA could quietly sweep under the rug. They had to own their incompetence, and for once, Karen didn't get the last word. But she wasn't done facing consequences. Without Todd sneaking favors for her, Karen's driveway became a solid sheet of ice. While the rest of the neighborhood enjoyed their freshly plowed streets, her property stood frozen and untouched, a perfect example of karma in action. Every morning, I'd sip my coffee on the porch and watch her struggle to chip away at the ice with the same shovel she stole from me. She'd grunt and curse under her breath, occasionally shooting me a glare when she caught me watching. But I just smiled and waved. One particularly cold evening, as I pulled into my driveway after work, I noticed something that almost made me feel bad. Karen's SUV was stuck, halfway up her frozen driveway, tires spinning helplessly as the vehicle slowly slid backward. Her hands were tight on the steering wheel, her body jerking forward as she repeatedly slammed the gas. But it was useless. If she kept pushing it, she'd either spin out or slide straight into the street. I could have left her there. I had every reason to. Instead, I grabbed a bag of rock salt and a shovel, walked over without a word, and started spreading salt around her tires. Karen rolled down her window, frowning in confusion. "What are you doing?" she asked, her voice unusually subdued. "Saving you from wrecking your car," I muttered, still working. She hesitated, then simply said, "Why?" I shrugged. "Because I'd rather not watch you cause a 10-car pileup." She didn't thank me. Karen never thanked anyone. But she didn't stop me either. And after a few more minutes, she finally managed to back her SUV into place without crashing. She climbed out, arms crossed tightly over her chest. "You win," she muttered, barely audible. Then, without another word, she turned and went inside. The days that followed were strangely quiet. The HOA left me alone. The power stayed on. No more trash mysteriously appeared on my porch. It was as if, for the first time in weeks, the neighborhood had finally returned to normal. The tension between us didn't disappear, but it changed. Instead of petty acts of revenge, there were just awkward nods when we crossed paths. I'd love to say Karen learned her lesson, but let's be real, people like her never do. Still, for the first time since this whole ridiculous feud began, my home finally felt like my home again. And that was enough. Have you ever had to deal with a nightmare neighbor or an HOA that seemed determined to make your life miserable? Share your experiences below, let's see who had it worse.